We're told that architectural knowledge evolved gradually, that builders learned through apprenticeships, that each generation passed skills to the next in an unbroken chain. But in 1842, stonemasons in Philadelphia erected the Girard College building using load-bearing techniques that required calculating compression ratios most modern structural engineers would need software to verify. The building still stands. The methods used to calculate its internal stress distribution aren't taught in contemporary architecture programs. They were considered standard practice at the time. Across the Atlantic, Victorian railway stations featured vaulted glass ceilings spanning distances that today require finite element analysis to approve. Engineers in the 1850s did this with slide rules and reference tables. The tables still exist in archives. The intuitive understanding of how to use them effectively does not. What we're examining isn't the existence of these structures. It's the knowledge framework they assume. This is a documentary exploration of observable patterns in historical architecture and infrastructure. It presents multiple perspectives on historical discontinuity. No single interpretation is endorsed. The evidence invites examination. The standard explanation holds that industrialization rapidly advanced building techniques, that mass production enabled complexity, that 19th-century engineers were simply exceptionally trained. This explanation accounts for most of what we see, but it encounters friction in specific places. In 1851, the Crystal Palace was erected in London's Hyde Park in under 6 months. The structure used 293,655 panes of glass and 5,000 iron columns. It covered 19 acres. The engineering required precise load calculations for a modular system that had never been attempted at that scale. Joseph Paxton designed it. He was a gardener by training. The construction employed 2,000 workers who assembled prefabricated components with speed that suggested familiarity. Contemporary accounts describe the process as efficient but unremarkable, as if building transparent iron cathedrals was a known procedure. The knowledge required to design that structure isn't preserved in the historical record the way the structure itself is. We have Paxton's drawings. We have the building. We don't have the reference system that made the drawings possible without modern computational tools. This gap appears repeatedly. Across the American Midwest, courthouses built between 1840 and 1880 feature acoustic design principles that optimize sound distribution without electronic amplification. The dome of the Iowa State Capitol, completed in 1886, allows a whisper at the ground floor to be heard clearly 5 stories above through calculated resonance. Audio engineers today study these buildings to understand how this was achieved. The mathematics of acoustic wave propagation wasn't formalized until the early 20th century. Yet the buildings demonstrate applied understanding of principles that supposedly hadn't been theorized yet. The architects left drawings. They left correspondence. They didn't leave the educational framework that taught them to think in those terms. This pattern intensifies when examining water systems. In 1842, New York began construction of the Croton Aqueduct. The system delivered 40 million gallons daily through a gravity-fed network spanning 41 miles. The gradient calculations required precision measuring within inches over distances of miles. The margin for error was functionally zero. The chief engineer, John Jervis, had formal training in canal engineering. The aqueduct required hydrostatic knowledge several orders of magnitude more complex than canal work. Jervis completed the project ahead of schedule. His notebooks show calculations. They don't show where he learned the underlying principles that made those calculations possible. Similar systems appeared simultaneously across the industrializing world. London's sewer network, Paris's water distribution, Philadelphia's grid. Each required gravitational flow calculations assuming zero powered assistance. Each worked on the first attempt. The knowledge density is unusual, but it's the educational gap that creates tension. By the 1920s, architectural programs had formalized. Engineering degrees standardized. But the curriculum focused on new materials, steel frame construction, reinforced concrete, electric systems. The masonry acoustics, the gravity hydraulics, the load-bearing stone calculations that defined the previous century's infrastructure weren't central to the training. By the 1950s, they'd largely disappeared from professional education. Today, restoration architects working on 19th-century buildings frequently encounter structural decisions they can't initially explain. Not because the buildings are poorly designed. Because the design logic assumes a reference framework no longer taught. The buildings require reverse engineering. This creates an unusual situation. Structures still in use, still functional, built using knowledge that's no longer systematically transmitted. The information exists in the buildings themselves. It exists scattered across historical documents. It doesn't exist as a coherent, teachable system. Which raises a question about continuity. If knowledge was passed generationally through apprenticeship, we'd expect to see gradual evolution. Techniques building incrementally. Complexity increasing slowly as understanding deepened. Instead, we see sudden competency. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, was the longest canal in the world at the time. The engineering team had no precedent for a project at that scale in that terrain. They succeeded on the first attempt. The canal operated for a century. Where did the knowledge come from? Standard history suggests it was synthesized from European precedents. That American engineers studied foreign systems and adapted them. This is documented. It's accurate. But the adaptation happened faster than the learning curve would suggest. And it happened simultaneously across multiple disciplines. Canals, railways, water systems, civic architecture, all advancing in parallel, all requiring specialized knowledge, all appearing within a narrow window. The density feels compressed. By the 1860s, small towns across the American Midwest had train stations with vaulted ceilings and calculated acoustics. County courthouses with domed rotundas. Water towers using hydrostatic principles most modern engineers would need to reference textbooks to apply. These weren't major cities. They were settlements of a few thousand people. Yet their civic infrastructure assumed access to highly specialized engineering knowledge. The timing raises questions about how that knowledge was distributed. The pattern becomes more defined when examining infrastructure that preceded demand. In 1848, Chicago completed a water intake system extending 2 miles into Lake Michigan. The city's population was under 30,000. The system was designed to serve 300,000. City records show no projection justifying that capacity. The infrastructure was simply built at a scale the city wouldn't need for 30 years. This wasn't an isolated decision. Across the American Northeast and Midwest, between 1840 and 1880, municipalities installed water systems, sewer networks, and gas lines sized for populations significantly larger than current residents. The standard explanation frames this as optimistic planning, as forward-thinking civic leadership. But the consistency is unusual. Rochester, New York, Buffalo, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Indianapolis. Each built water distribution networks in the 1850s and 1860s capable of serving populations 2 to 3 times their current size. The engineering plans don't include written rationale for the capacity decisions. The infrastructure was simply constructed at that scale. The installations weren't experimental. They were uniform. Pipe diameters, valve systems, reservoir sizing, all followed similar proportional logic, as if referencing a common standard. City engineering departments operated independently. They weren't coordinating. Yet the systems share structural similarities that suggest a shared reference framework. The same pattern appears in rail infrastructure. By 1860, the United States had laid 30,000 miles of railway track. Much of it passed through territory with sparse population. The rails weren't built to connect existing cities. They were built in anticipation of settlement. This is documented. It's part of the Western expansion narrative. But the engineering exceeded anticipated need. Track gauges were standardized before federal regulation required it. Bridge load capacities were calculated for train weights that wouldn't exist for decades. Station architecture in frontier towns matched the scale of stations in established cities. The infrastructure assumed future demand, but it also assumed future use patterns that hadn't been established yet. Railway stations in towns of 2,000 people featured multiple platforms, covered waiting areas, and freight handling systems designed for traffic volumes the towns wouldn't generate for 50 years. If the rails were speculative, the stations were more so. They represented capital investment and functionality that had no immediate purpose. Yet they were built anyway. And they were built using design principles that remained consistent across hundreds of independent projects. Britain shows a parallel pattern. Between 1830 and 1870, Victorian engineers constructed sewer systems beneath London, Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham sized for populations that wouldn't exist until the 20th century. Joseph Bazalgette's London sewer network, completed in 1865, was designed to handle waste from 4 million people. London's population at the time was 2.8 million. Bazalgette is credited with visionary planning. But his plans don't explain how he calculated future population density with such precision that his system remained adequate for 70 years without major expansion. The mathematics required wouldn't be formalized until urban planning became an academic discipline in the early 1900s. He built it anyway. The system used gravity-fed flow through tunnels calculated to maintain velocity sufficient to prevent blockage. The gradient calculations required understanding sediment transport dynamics that weren't theoretically described until decades later. Yet the system worked immediately. It still functions today with minimal modification. This suggests either extraordinary intuition or access to reference principles not evident in the historical record. Storage infrastructure presents similar questions. Grain elevators built across the American Midwest in the 1870s and 1880s were engineered to handle harvest volumes far exceeding regional output at the time. The elevator in Buffalo, New York, completed in 1873, could store 1 million bushels. Regional grain production in 1873 was approximately 400,000 bushels annually. The structure wasn't built for current need. It was built for projected growth. But the projection assumed mechanized farming techniques that hadn't been widely adopted yet. The capacity anticipated a shift in agricultural production methods that wouldn't fully materialize for another 20 years. Someone calculated future output based on variables that hadn't stabilized. And they did this across dozens of facilities, each one sized beyond immediate economic justification, each one eventually proving appropriately scaled. The administrative systems mirror the physical infrastructure. Property record systems established in the mid-1800s across the United States and Britain used classification frameworks that anticipated urban complexity those regions hadn't yet experienced. Land parcel identification codes in Chicago's 1850 cadastral system included designations for building types that didn't exist in Chicago at the time: multi-story commercial structures, industrial facilities, mixed-use developments. The record-keeping assumed future urban form. Tax assessment frameworks created in the 1860s included categories for infrastructure: gas lines, water connections, sewer access, that many towns hadn't installed yet. The administrative structure was built before the physical infrastructure was designed to track. This isn't evidence of conspiracy. It's evidence of systematization beyond apparent necessity. Court systems established in frontier territories during the 1850s and 1860s were structured to handle case volumes and case types those territories weren't generating. The frameworks included appellate procedures, jurisdictional hierarchies, and administrative protocols appropriate for established legal systems, not frontier settlements. Yet the systems were implemented immediately. By the 1870s, county courthouses across the Midwest featured record storage rooms designed for document volumes that wouldn't accumulate for 50 years. Vault dimensions, shelving systems, environmental controls, all sized beyond contemporary need. The infrastructure assumed institutional continuity at a scale the institutions hadn't reached. Educational facilities follow the same logic. Public schools built in the 1860s and 1870s across the American frontier included classroom configurations, laboratory spaces, and library facilities designed for curricula that hadn't been implemented yet. The physical architecture anticipated pedagogical approaches that would become standard in the early 20th century. The buildings were ready before the educational system knew what to do with them. And the construction quality suggests confidence. These weren't temporary structures built cheaply in anticipation of future replacement. They were permanent facilities built with materials and techniques intended to last generations, as if the builders knew the infrastructure would eventually be needed at the scale they were constructing it. The knowledge required to make those decisions, to calculate future population density, future traffic volumes, future institutional complexity, isn't preserved as a coherent methodology. We have the infrastructure. We don't have the planning framework that created it, which returns to the question of knowledge transmission. If each generation of engineers learned from the previous generation, we'd expect to see documentation of that learning. Textbooks, training manuals, apprenticeship records showing how 19th century engineers acquired the skills to build systems that modern engineers study as historical anomalies. Some documentation exists, but it's fragmented. It shows what was built. It rarely explains how the builders knew to build it that way. The gap suggests either that much of the documentation has been lost, or that the knowledge was transmitted through informal channels that left minimal written record. Or it suggests something else about the continuity of technical knowledge between the late 18th and mid-19th centuries. Whether this reflects inheritance or convergence remains open to interpretation. The term Tartaria originates in European cartography. It was a geographic label used from the medieval period through the 18th century to describe regions of Central and Northern Asia. The name appears on maps produced across Europe with varying boundaries. By the early 1800s, the term had largely fallen out of formal use as geographic knowledge improved and political boundaries were redrawn. In recent years, the term has been reinterpreted. Online communities have adopted Tartaria as a label for a proposed historical framework. The framework suggests that advanced infrastructure from the 18th and 19th centuries represents inherited knowledge rather than rapid innovation. This reinterpretation has generated three primary models of interpretation. The first model treats Tartaria as a literal advanced civilization that existed prior to the modern era. Proponents point to architectural consistency, engineering sophistication, and the speed of infrastructure development as evidence of knowledge inheritance rather than independent innovation. This interpretation is not supported by mainstream academic consensus but represents one perspective on the patterns we've examined. The second model treats Tartaria as a metaphor for knowledge discontinuity. Under this framework, the term doesn't refer to a specific civilization but to the observable gap between the knowledge demonstrated in 19th century infrastructure and the knowledge preserved in contemporary educational systems. This interpretation focuses on the loss or disruption of technical transmission rather than proposing alternative historical narratives. The third model maintains that no discontinuity exists. It argues that the patterns we've examined reflect normal industrial acceleration, that documentation loss is expected over time, and that reverse engineering historical structures is a function of changed materials and methods rather than lost knowledge. This remains the dominant academic position. All three interpretations are attempting to explain the same evidence. The infrastructure exists. The buildings stand. The systems function. The knowledge required to create them isn't systematically taught. These are observations, not conclusions. What remains unresolved is whether this represents loss, transformation, or misunderstanding of how knowledge was originally transmitted. The timing window matters here. Between 1816 and 1850, global infrastructure development accelerated across multiple continents simultaneously. This period follows what's known historically as the year without a summer, 1816, when volcanic activity disrupted climate patterns worldwide. The years immediately following saw widespread crop failure, population displacement, and economic disruption. By the 1820s, large-scale infrastructure projects had begun across Europe and North America. The speed of recovery is documented. What's less documented is where the technical knowledge for that recovery came from, particularly in regions that had experienced significant population loss. If knowledge transmission depends on continuity, disruption should create gaps. Yet the infrastructure built after 1816 shows no indication of reduced technical capability. If anything, it shows acceleration. This isn't proof of anything. It's an observation about timing that invites questions about resilience of technical knowledge during periods of social disruption. The metaphor of Tartaria, in its second interpretation, captures something about that question. It provides a label for the possibility that knowledge systems can persist through disruption in ways that aren't fully visible in written records. That infrastructure itself can serve as a repository of information separate from the documentation that supposedly explains it. Whether that metaphor is useful depends on what questions we're trying to answer. If the question is whether buildings were constructed using knowledge we no longer systematically teach, the answer is observable. Restoration architects confirm this regularly. The techniques exist in the structures themselves. They're studied, reverse-engineered, and occasionally reapplied. But they're not part of standard professional training. If the question is why that knowledge isn't taught, the answers become speculative. Material changes, methodological shifts, economic priorities, all provide partial explanations. None fully account for the completeness of the transition. The evidence doesn't resolve into a single narrative. It sits in productive tension. The infrastructure remains. The knowledge it represents remains partially accessible. The system that transmitted that knowledge is no longer intact. What we're left with is buildings that still stand, built using methods we're still learning to understand, constructed during a period of rapid systematization that hasn't been fully explained. The timing invites examination. The scale creates friction. The pattern suggests something about how technical knowledge moves through time, preserved, disrupted, or transformed in ways that leave traces in stone and iron longer than they leave traces in curriculum. The evidence remains open. The buildings remain standing. The questions remain unresolved.